Is it possible to figure out what's really going on in Iran? Shireen Hunter, a research professor at Georgetown University, says yes. She'll explain why next on Global Perspectives.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to Global Perspectives. Iran is in the news every day, but what do we really know about it? For answers, we turn to Shireen Hunter, a longtime Iran scholar and a research professor at Georgetown University. Welcome to the show, Dr. Hunter.
My pleasure, John.
Tell us something about Iran that we don't know, that might not be common knowledge.
Well, I think that perhaps what we really need to know more about Iran, that it is a far more complex country, and that there are many, many different opinions and views, rather than the image we have that they are all radicals and they are all hardliners. There are a lot of different perspectives, and unfortunately, some of these perspectives are in conflict with one another.
So how do we go about sorting through what is real and what isn't?
Well, the thing is that all of these things are real. On the one hand, I think that we really do have a growing, particularly as far as at the popular level is concerned, what I would call a more national perspective versus a revolutionary and extremist perspective among the people that is growing. Now, this perspective really does want to end Iran's isolation. They do want to become integrated in the outside world, and they also want to reinvigorate and revitalize countries' economy and provide a better living standard. Now, unfortunately, this perspective runs counter to the material and power interests of certain group that we have come to know either as radicals or as hardliners who have so far benefited from almost, I would say, Iran's partially self-imposed isolation and are frightened of any hint of greater opening to the outside world.
But how do you assess Iran's position in the Middle East today? There are some who say that it's stronger than ever, that it's rising on all fronts, and that there's essentially nothing stopping it. And then there are others who say that it's simply finding its natural place in a region where it has exercised influence in a greater or lesser capacity for all of recorded time.
Well, maybe actually I am a dissenter when it comes to this notion that Iran is the rising power in the Middle East or has a great amount of influence in the region. I really don't think that that is the case. And one of the things is that if you look actually at what Iran has been able to do, and I will give you two examples. One was the example of Bahrain in 2011-12, when together with the Arab Spring, we also had demonstrations and protest movements in Bahrain. Now, Bahrain historically was part of Iran, although after the British came to power, Iran's actual control over the island was undermined. However, Iran did not do anything in regard to Bahrain, even though many of the Shiites were very badly treated by the Al Khalifa family. Then you look at what the Saudis did. The Saudis basically sent troops under the guise of the Peninsula She'll. And even the UAE, the little UAE, sent troops in there. Now, to me, this is not the behavior of a very powerful country which is on the rise. And even if you look at Yemen, the Saudis have been bombing Yemen now for quite some time. Yes, Iran might have given some help, to the Houthis and so on, but or there may be, some behind-the-scene activities by Iranian Revolutionary Guards, but we haven't seen any Iranian troops going into Yemen or any direct military action going on. And even when it comes to really Syria, yes, Iran has helped the Assad regime to some extent show more resistance than probably it would have been done. But ultimately it's not Iran who's going to decide Syria's fate. And so I don't believe, and I think that, talking too much about Iran's power, we actually are giving ammunition to the hardliners to say, you see how wonderful we are, how powerful we have become, and so why we should change our behavior abroad.
How do you assess the power of the ones in control vis-a-vis the masses of the people? Is this something that at some point could produce a change?
Well, I think that definitely. I would say at the very least, I think 70% of the people in Iran would like to see some change. However, I think they don't want a revolutionary change anymore. I think that the consequences of the Islamic Revolution, I believe, and all indications are been so traumatizing for the people. And of course also events that have occurred in the Middle East, particularly after the Arab Spring, where there was a lot of hope raised when people came out in the streets that they were going to be able to have more democratic, more open. And then this was followed either by civil war, as in Syria, or in Egypt with a kind of, again, another wave of repression. I think that many Iranians are chastised by that. So they put up with certain aspects of the government's behavior, but definitely every time they have a chance to go actually to the polls, they vote for the candidate that says that is going to try to open up, is going to try to reform it. So Iran actually has changed. Unfortunately, a minority, and Revolutionary Guards are among them, that have benefited from this situation. They just want to hold on and not let go.
So what happens next? Is this sort of a status quo situation for the foreseeable future, or is there anything that could precipitate significant change?
Well, I think that, ultimately, I remember in 1992 in a book that I published, I said the Islamic system has only two choices. Either they will have, if they want to survive, they have to reform. They have to reform far more towards not just moderation, but towards the democratization and the gradually reduction of the more religious authoritarian aspect into a more civilian, democratic, representative type of government. Otherwise, in time, these contradictions, is going to tear them apart. I think Rafsanjani, when he tried in the early 90s to try to reform, it was that because of this realization. Mohammad Khatami tried to do that also because of that. Then we had a kind of sliding back under Ahmadinejad in the early 2000s. Now Rouhani is trying to do that. However, I also happen to believe that in the past, unfortunately, the approach of the Western world in general, and the US in particular, was such that it did not really help strengthen the moderates. I can understand why people were sort of shy of embracing the Iranian moderates, because we have had our disappointments, and we try to do, and like in the Iran-Contra or whatever, and then didn't get what we expected. So I understand that people were cautious, but I think that now we have another chance, and I think we can do certain things that might help, and I think, in fact, I can say that it will help, and that is several things. First, we really have to make this nuclear agreement work. For many, particularly hardliners, if we don't implement the agreement, they're going to just again argue that you cannot trust the West, you cannot trust the Americans, and so on. And so the sanctions lifting and so on will help a lot. We should encourage European at the beginning, but also American businesses to do business with Iran. We shouldn't wait until all aspects of their behavior is changed before we can allow these things to go. I believe that having more economic integration and intercourse might actually facilitate political change as well. And then very cautiously, maybe on case-by-case on a case-by-case basis, we can cooperate on certain things. Obviously, they have to do their share. This goes without saying. Whether it is in Afghanistan, where we do have some overlapping strategic interests, or even in regard to now the Islamic State in Iraq and in Syria, this will help the moderate. They will say, you see, constructive engagement with outside world pays off. But we also have to be patient, because the hardliners in Iran are going to do everything they can to make it difficult for us to pursue this. But we have to be the bigger sort of person, shall we say, in this relationship, and not be fazed by the hardliners' attacks. And you have to keep thinking that, look, 70% of the Iranian population wants a better relation, wants opening up to the outside world.
But in addition to the masses, there are other countries that would not like to see better U.S.-Iran relations, and I'm thinking of Russia in particular.
Sure.
How does all of that play into the conversation? And the Russian posture now in the Middle East, generally speaking, is much more aggressive.
That's right. I think that, but we can, again, I would say that one of the reasons I believe that the Russians have been able to make the inroad recently that they have, obviously there are many, many factors behind it, but some of it has to do with the fact that we didn't really pursue better relations with Iran where we could have. For example, we had some chances in 2003 to maybe at least to try. You know, I don't know whether Iranians at the time were sincere or they were just frightened, you know, of our military presence in the region or whatever. But we didn't even explore that possibility. And I think that in regard to the Syrian situation, I think perhaps we overemphasized the Iran angle of it a little bit, you know, too much. And I think that Russians have used that. But beyond the Middle East, even in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, and so on, our policy of isolating Iran has actually helped the Russians. For example, the fact that we're not very open to Iranian energy flowing into Caucasus or Central Asia or South Asia, particularly in Caucasus, it has helped Russia to leverage its energy, the control of this country's energy needs, like in Georgia and other places. So I think that to some extent, Russia has been benefiting from some of, shall we say, that are missed opportunities for perhaps a better use of connections with Iran, even if we didn't have to go all the way, actually, to, you know, vastly improving relations. There were things we could have done, and even now there are things that we could do. Because I think there are, we have to know that in Iran, there is a lot of suspicion of Russia. Some of it obviously is historic. You know, Russia has been engaged with Iran for 200 years, and often the rivalry with Britain and so on. And the other thing is that the Iranians have a lot of recent bad memories of Russia not fulfilling its commitments to Iran. I mean, the whole saga of the Bushehr nuclear power plant, it took, I don't know, it's about 30 years almost now, and I am not sure whether it still is functioning or not. I haven't read anything anymore about it. Then you had this issue of the Iranians bought this air defense system, and it hasn't been delivered. And now that they are trying in competition with us or trying to get Iran to their side, saying, oh, we are going to give it to you, but we have to solve some technical problem. Well, you know, the same thing was with Bushehr. They had to solve technical problems. These technical problems can go on and on. But so there is a window of opportunity. The moderates in Iran want greater engagement with the West, with Europe. They would prefer to have, initially with Western Europe, but then, in time with America. Some of the hardliners, they'd rather go with Russia and maybe even China, even though there's no economic benefit in those relationships for Iran. Russians don't have the money to give to Iran. Their technology is not as advanced as Western technology. And of course, Chinese just want to sell to Iran. Mm-hmm. There's nothing else. They want to just sell everything, from their daily bread to their, whatever. we have to also be smart and get in there.
Take us back in time. You served in the Iranian Foreign Service under a different government.
Very different.
And you were the first woman to
That's
serve in the
right.
Iranian
That's
Foreign
right.
Service.
That's
Tell
right.
us about that experience. What was it like, and what did you bring with you through your life from that?
Well, I must say it was very, very positive. I learned an awful lot. I was lucky enough. I served in 2 postings. One was in London, and the other one was in Geneva in the United Nations. And I had some minor talents, including my language capacities, that enabled me actually to perform certain functions that made it possible for me to take part in a lot of meetings with my foreign minister and foreign dignitaries and so on, and traveled to certain countries, part of delegation. And so I did see, in a way, both in the multilateral diplomacy, but at the UN, United Nations, but also in bilateral diplomacy. And it helped me because I also studied international relations as a graduate student. So I just could see the connection that how the theory was actually happens in practice. And then, and so I thought that always was very, very helpful to me. And again, particularly, I really enjoyed the multilateral diplomacy because it brought me in contact with so many people from so many different parts of the world. And I think I learned from all of those people. And also learn to appreciate different cultures and also to see that you can be friends even if you disagree on certain things. I will tell you an anecdote if we have time.
Sure.
When I was a young delegate in United Nations, Iran's relations with Iraq at the time was still very, very tense. They had not yet signed the Algiers agreement that finally resolved their disputes and so. So and of course Iran and Iraq in UN were sitting next to one another. And here I was, this young, rather shy woman sitting there, and this Iraqi, diplomat is sitting there. And he did something that I appreciated. He said, we have to at least be here for 2 months and so on, as long as the commission is in session. We either can be civil to one another and talk and whatever, or to be miserable and sit here in silence. So which one you prefer? I said, I don't see why we couldn't, as 2 human beings, be civil to one another. And and it was a far more pleasant experience. Mm-hmm. So I think that these are some of the things that I learned, shall we say, the more personal and human dimension of diplomacy, because we learn it in books and everything is very abstract. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, this is done by people, by ordinary human beings.
You recently wrote a book on Iran.
That's
Tell
right.
us about that, and are there any special insights you can share with us?
Yes. It's try to explain in a way, both to myself in some ways, but also perhaps a little bit more to others, why this revolution happened in Iran. Why are these debates that are going on in Iran? We have a lot of, it's not just a question between religion and secularism. It's not just a question nationalism versus Islam. And this essentially, in this, I'm trying to explain that I said Iran is a country that has many, many cultural and other contradictions and fault lines. And in a way, Iran has what I call a divided soul. And the part of this reason, obviously, is, one, the very long history of Iran. And the other thing is the traumatic events that Iran has undergone. And the most, of course, in my opinion, traumas for Iran was the Arab conquest and the Islamization of Iran. I would say that of all the countries that the Arabs invaded, exception of Spain also, Iran was the only country that escaped Arabization. They became Muslim, but even their Islam is of a different flavor. And also partly because Iran had a very, very sophisticated civilization, including a religion of its own, a cosmology of its own, and a worldview and so on, and language and arts and so on and so forth. And this didn't die away. But different people in Iran tended to gravitate differently. So all this debate that has been going on in Iran since the 60s, but of course with the Islamic system, between Iranian nationalism and Islam, between pre-Islamic Iran and the Islamic Iran, these have very deep roots. The other thing I try to bring into all this is that this debate remained largely dormant because it wasn't until about middle of 19th century so much related to the actual power. But with modernization coming, culture became politicized. So it had political implication whether you were a lover of Islamic Iran and you want to resurrect it to distinctly Iranian identity and so on, or you were an Islamic thing. The nationalists tended to be modernizers. And this, of course, upset the clergy. It upset the traditional classes. A lot of misunderstandings about the Shah is not that it wasn't just he was not very democratic or whatever. He was not any worse than some of the other people. But he wanted to modernize. So a lot of people didn't want that, because their power, their influence would go. And I'm trying to say that ultimately, this clash of Iran and Islam and modernism and tradition, all of this came together and culminated in the Islamic Revolution. But the Islamic Revolution didn't end the debate. Mm-hmm. So these are still going on. So the struggle for the soul of Iran is still going on. And of course, it has become even more closely linked with power. And so we shall see. Of course, my own hope is that I'm not saying that Islam should disappear, or no, it will not happen, that it's been there 1,400 years and so on, but that a more gentle, the Iranian kind of version of Islam and the more Iranian national identity will triumph. And I think if that does, then I think that a lot of the animosities and so on that has been built up, certainly with the West, I think that will disappear. Although not necessarily with some of Iran's neighbors. That was there before the West got in there and probably will stay there for a while. Although one can obviously mitigate even those.
What is your current research project?
My last research project was it is a little bit more, I wouldn't say theoretical, but it was a little bit more general rather than specific to either Iran or to Islam and so on. And it's the role of religion in international affairs, assessment of the role of religion in international affairs. I have given it a working title called With God on Our Side. Everybody claims that God is on their side. And I have several case studies, and it's at the moment being under consideration, reviewed, and I know that at least there are 2 positive reviews, and we are waiting for the 3rd. So hopefully if that happens, it will sometime in 2016 will come out. And then my next project is going to be in one of my other interests, which is the Caucasus and Central Asia. So I'm going to do a project on potential impact of the Iran deal on the politics and geopolitics of the Caucasus.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Hunter.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia. We'll see you next time.